And we're live with our 278th episode of Absolute AppSec. I'm Ken Johnson at CK Tricky on social media, joined by my co-host Seth Law at Seth Law on social media. Seth, say hi.
Hey, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the podcast. Excited to be here today. I'm repping my Crocs and socks shirt, as one does on, early March in whatever, right? Like when it's crappy weather out, I guess. We're excited to be back and to chat. We've had a couple of guests on the last few weeks, but this week we are going to dive back into news and just some other things that have been on our minds for the last month or so, just in general. But I did want to give a shout out, first of all, to Redpoint for being our sponsor today. Redpoint Security specializes in code security by coders, which is bolstered by years of experience testing applications and conducting code reviews against all types of applications. Redpoint also offers secure code training to help ground your teams in better security practices across the development lifecycle. So check out redpointsecurity.com for more information and put your company on a path to better security. Thanks to Redpoint. Sweet. As far as announcements go, we've got a couple of things that are running. I'm going to be at Appray Cyber this week up in Park City, Utah. I'm giving a talk on Friday. Excited to run through modern versus old school again. But we also have some training opportunities that are coming up. The biggest one is the virtual training of Practical Secure Code Review, the AI enhanced version, on March 27th and 28th. Go to training.absoluteappsec.com if you would like to attend. This class is selling quickly. It's the first time that we've done Practical Secure Code Review, and since I think November was the last time we did. We had a couple sessions last fall, but would love to see you there. Would love to have you. I know we've been talking about DEF CON trainings. There's been a shakeup over there. However, and we will be teaching at DEF CON in Vegas, either Practical Secure Code Review or, harnessing LLMs for application security. We haven't determined which one yet. We're working with the DEF CON crew to figure that out. If you have a preference, please let us know. It looks like the Seattle event I don't know if it's been canceled or what's going on with it. So that one's off the calendar for now. So we will be doing more trainings though in the future. Let us know if you need training or you're looking for a specific time frame in which we can offer it. Otherwise, Ken, I'm trying to think if there's any other announcements, anything else we need to talk about before we start diving into the articles this week.
Well, the B-Sides, I guess the last thing that's good news is that B-Sides SF panel was approved for the state of Absolute AppSec. So we've got a couple guests locked in. I think you might have even announced this last week, but we've got. And also, I was going to mention, I'll tease it out, but I can't give too many details right now. I'll say this: there will be a very small invite-only AI security and summit thing that we're running I'll tell you what, when I have the actual link to post people, and again, it's an invite only, so I'm not sure how I'll actually run this yet. I'm still hammering out the details, but there will be something for RSA that's pretty interesting. We've got a couple amazing speakers already locked in, and that's all I can really say right now. So there'll be more news on that front as well. I assume how it comes up, man. Yeah, we'll see.
Yep. We'll be talking about it. There's some, it'll be a good couple hour thing that would be worth your while if you're in the space. That's all. So with that, we will be in San Francisco for B-Sides and RSA. You're probably staying for all of RSA. I don't know if I can handle San Francisco.
For a whole week. I
don't think I can handle it for that long. Just gonna be honest. So we'll see how
long hotel. You don't even want to know how long for like a week out there during that time. You have no idea. Like, you don't want to know what my hotel bill is going to be. I saw the in advance cost of just a basic room, and I wept a bit. So in any case,
you wept a bit. Yes,
week is going to be hard. We'll say
hard.
that. It'll be
Yes,
challenging.
yes, it will be challenging.
I could see myself after 4 days being like, I think maybe James has this, and I'm just gonna go. So we'll see.
Yeah, have
I don't
fun
know.
working that floor. I don't know. Yeah, we've been doing that for quite a while, and yeah, I don't. On that note, though, right? Like you've been going, like you and I have been going to RSA, Black Hat, DEF CON for years. What are your feelings about RSA as just overall a conference? I get a lot of questions on this.
Oh man, that's a good. Well, yeah, that's. I think we've talked like, yeah, this. I don't know what to say. That's new. I would say. Well, I guess my perspective has changed in the sense that, well, not my perspective on the conference, but my perspective on the value I'm getting from the conference, probably, right? Like for
Hmm.
me, it's now really great because of the business aspect. Um, so I get to connect with potential buyers. I get to connect with, investors, with people, with friends, of course, as well. I mean, there's always that at any conference, but I think uniquely um, a business perspective, again, like you've got all the investors there, you've got all the partnerships there, you've got all the potential buyers there. Now, in terms of the technical content, which is probably the thing people should care about and whatnot, I've spoken there before with Chris Gates on attacking DevOps infrastructure. It was a very technical talk. So, obviously biased, but I would say for sure there's technical talks and whatnot to that you can get value out of. What did surprise me was I always thought, oh wow, RSA's vendor booth thing is super super crazy. But then I went to Black Hat and I was like, well, it's not really that different, really. RSA is maybe an order of magnitude bigger, uh, for sure, because there are like two different parts of Moscone where they have different, setups. So there's a lot of booths, but it's pretty similar in that way too. So I mean, I actually what I would say is probably RSA and Black Hat to me looked a little bit more similar than um, any other conferences. But yeah, what about you?
Yeah, that's kind of what I go back to, right? Like there's technical conferences and then there's business conferences, and you can get value out of both of them. It just kind of depends on your mindset, right? If you're an engineer and only a technician, aren't interested in talking to people like about the business side of things, RSA and Black Hat become less interesting. Doesn't mean that there isn't good research that comes out of it, and you could just do technical talks on a daily basis and get something out of it. Uh, but I always go back and forth on whether or not the cost is justified, because Black Hat and RSA, from if I'm getting my business to pay for me to go as a technician, are really expensive conferences, like thousands and thousands of dollars. If you're doing the trainings at either of them as well, like training is pretty expensive, and you are getting top-notch training and you're getting top-notch technical content, and that's why the business comes. Uh, but there are better deals that are out there. I would say, as far as, right, like you're going to get a lot of the same content if you go to, DEF CON is kind of the easy one because it's right after Black Hat. But a lot of the B-sides conferences as well, you find those diamonds in the rough there. So yeah, from a technical perspective, that I guess what I'm saying is take it with a grain of salt. If your company can sponsor you to go, you can still have a great experience and you can get a lot of good experience out of it. From a business perspective, Black Hat and RSA, and you and I have dealt with this, feel more like an obligation because of all the people that are there, because of the partners, because of the opportunities, because that's where people congregate and start to make deals. Uh, you know, I mean, honestly, you guys did what, Startup Row or whatever it was called, Innovator,
Yeah,
right?
Black Hat, yeah,
At
Startup
Black Hat,
Spotlight.
right? Yeah, that stuff is invaluable as a small business, right? It is, as a startup,
Yeah,
and that's where it begins. Is okay, like we've been going to RSA for years, haven't always attended the conference, to be honest, but we're there. We're going to all of the community events because that's where people are, and yeah, that's where you make the connections. So
yeah.
yeah.
B also like if you come in early for B sides, like you'll definitely get value out of B sides. Also, the cost of B sides is not, obviously nearly what it is at RSA. So you get your hallway con, you get to see your friends, you get to attend technical talks. It's certainly a lot more affordable. Obviously, sitting in a movie theater seat, big recliner as you watch a technical talk is ridiculously nice. And then if you stay through RSA for a couple days, that's when everybody is there. So usually you can catch up with people that you really want to catch up with that maybe. So if you're going to do B sides for any reason, it's worth staying at least for a day or two after just to catch the RSA crowd. Similar to DEF CON Black Hat or Black Hat DEF CON, kind of how that
Yep.
works. So I would say like now that I'm in the business world, I guess it's really more valuable. But if I look back to when I was more like an internal defender of a company, RSA didn't provide as much value to me. Even going to BS sides SF wouldn't have provided much value other than talking to people and seeing people. And just because, it's like, well, there's a lot of conferences with technical talks and whatnot. So it's not, besides SF is awesome, don't get me wrong, but it's wouldn't make a trip across the country just for that.
Mhm.
In my
Yeah.
in my former role. But today, absolutely, like today, it's good to be there. So whatever. We
Yeah.
all, I mean, unless you do the same thing for your entire career, which is
It
rare,
changes. Yep.
it changes. Your focus is going to change where you care to go and what you care about. Should change if you're not doing the exact same thing. So,
Mhm.
and but you brought up something that triggered a thought in my head, and I actually wanted to ask you about this without you knowing I was going to ask you about this because
Uh-oh.
I don't know, just yes.
Yeah.
All right. I might have mentioned this to you, but this blew my mind. Within the last week or two, I found out that because I've never taken a SANS course. I've seen people take them. I go to ShmooCon and people would be like, "Oh, I just got done with my SANS course," and I think they would blend the two together. Anyways, what I thought, because I knew SANS courses were expensive, and I heard they were upwards of like $5,000. And then I found out in the last week or two that there's also a charge to get certified. So it's not enough to just take the course and pay the 5 grand. There's also like apparently additional costs if you want to then get the certificate for having then taken the training. So someone was telling me their company spent like 7 grand for like a cert and a little bit of training. And that blew my mind. And my question to you is, A, did you know that? And B, what are your thoughts on that cost structure? And have you ever
Yes.
taken a SANS course?
So one of my first certifications was actually GSEC. This would have been in about 2000 and like this is early days, right? So 2000, man, this would have been 2003, 2002, right? Like we're talking, 20 plus years ago, right? Um, and if you go to sans.org, Robert is absolutely right. Like you're talking about $9,000 for the courses now. The certification, if you want to do it, is usually about $1,000 more than that. Um, and this has always been their model, right? They've always had highly technical people. It's usually like a week long training course. Everything's gone up in price. I'm not overly surprised at that cost, to be honest with you, just having tracked it. I mean, I think when I did it back in the early 2000s, the cost of a week was 3 to 4 thousand, maybe like an extra couple $100 to do the certification at the time, right? And
Sure.
the certification, but it was a good intensive uh, course, right? Like, the hands on, they did nightly labs that you could participate in if you wanted to like expand out your knowledge. Like I know some of the instructors that are over there that get locked in as SANS instructors, and that's pretty much all that they do, right? As they travel around, they build new SANS courses, they teach those courses, and they're very dedicated. And so it's hard to say I don't know, like it's hard to say that it's not worth the value if you are dedicated and you have someone sponsoring you to go do that. As an independent, and I wouldn't have been able to afford it at that time in my career, right? Like it was a sponsored by the organization I was working for at the time, and they wanted me to go get it, right? Um, yeah, Net Wars, right? Um, the yeah, I mean that's like their like CTF that they go and do on a nightly basis. It's really fun, and it does push you, right? Like from an OSCP perspective, like the offensive security trainings, like they felt very similar from a lab perspective. I think the OSCP pushes you to do a lot more on your own, or the offensive security does, than kind of the instructor guided, question answer. Um, I don't know, right? Like, but yeah, in short, yes, I'm not overly surprised with that cost structure. Um,
Do you also
I
pay
mean,
for your hotel and food? I assume, or
mhm.
like, do they like do the catered breakfast and lunch and all that, or?
I believe that they do. If I remember right. That they had catered lunch, and even I think dinner was on your own, but they had snacks and right, like morning, afternoon coffee breaks type things.
Hmm.
So
I'm
yeah,
sure the training is great. I just when someone told me those numbers, it kind of blew my mind. Just knowing like how um the economy's been and spending for companies has been. It's like sometimes hard to imagine that. I mean, there's still plenty of companies able to spend money on things like this. So don't get me wrong. I just you hear the number, you're like, oh my god, like that's like that's that's crazy to me. Just it's a lot of money. I don't know what else to say.
it
Um,
is.
but
Yeah, it
but if
is.
it's worth it, then it's worth it.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you kind of want to like look to see if it's something that's really useful for you on a day-to-day basis. I'd have a hard time sending like um yeah, just kind of the generic. And I know nowadays too, they have like a full like uh degree or whatever they want to call it, where you go and like, oh, you did like 6 courses or whatever, and now you are a certified, and you did all the certifications along the way. You're basically a staff level engineer, whatever it is, right? Like they've got kind of like degree plans that are scheduled out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yep.
no,
And
I'm sorry. I'm also keeping up with Robert's chat because I'm like, or with the chat with Robert because he's like, I've never seen anyone pay out of pocket. I'm like, yeah, I would hope not, because if you did pay out of pocket, for me, it would be like one of those things where the coding camps that say, hey, you're guaranteed to get a job when you leave here. It's like, okay, if I paid out of pocket and you're guaranteeing me a job, that'd be different. Otherwise, definitely would not pay out of pocket, obviously, for training like that. But that is interesting in general. Sorry, I got us
yeah,
way off topic, man. I didn't even just like
no,
totally.
no, it's
Do we have a topic that we have to stick to? I don't think so.
yes, dang it. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I guess I will post to get us back looped towards some of these tracks. I did want to just I only want so we have been not really calling out, when companies get breached. We haven't really done much of that, right? Just because like most of the time it's the same old stuff, right? It's not that interesting. And this is actually one of those situations where it's a very not interesting breach in the sense of how they were breached. But what it
Yep.
is it kind of gets under my skin a little bit just because, like, first of all, tons of people use Zapier. I won't say whether or not I use Zapier, but given that I have an emotional reaction to Zapier's situation here, you do the math, right? So I'm reading this article. I'm thinking, well, I hope that this is like, this is probably something really convoluted and hard to do and whatever. And no, what it was, and this is what annoyed me, is that when you read the article, there's really two things that happened. Now, the first is they never required MFA on their engineers' GitHub profiles, which is just, dude, like that's basic hygiene. That's super basic hygiene. Come on. Like, you won't hear me usually criticize companies, but that one you deserve some criticism for. That is ridiculous. Like, if there's some basic things you can do just for everybody's, like, to turn a negative into a positive. There's some basic things you can do if your developers are on GitHub, right? You can for sure enable or require rather MFA. You can disallow personal email addresses, and you can make it so that they can even hide their company affiliations. You can do things which I think have more impact, like requiring signed commits, right? Because the Git protocol, if you're not familiar, the Git protocol itself is designed to be spoofed very easily. It was never its attribution is entirely user supplied, right? You attest to who
Yep.
you are. You can change that to be whoever you want. I even, like in 2013, speaking about those talks with Chris Gates and the DevOps stuff, I showed like me doing creating commits on a pull request as Linus Torvalds, right? Just to
Yep.
illustrate where it literally was his profile image and all that stuff. Because it's easy with So to with the Git protocol, so to avoid that attribution issue, use signed commits, and then GitHub will rely on your GPG key signature rather than you saying you are who you are, which obviously you can lie. So there's a whole bunch of other hardening things, and I'm pretty sure GitHub has a guide out there. But like, dude, that really did get under my skin because it's such an easy thing to do, and that, of course, the developer chose a weak password. People choose weak passwords. In any case, okay. So the second thing, though, now this is a positive for them, is that they did at least detect that there was unauthorized access to their repositories. How they did that, I don't really know. I would hope it was through some really good IR detection and response things. It might have just been they noticed someone committing code or changing issues or whatever. So I don't really know. I want to give them the benefit of the doubt on that one. But so then, right. So then the second thing that happened is they noticed there was some unauthorized access. And when they started auditing what was in those repositories, then they realized that a developer had, or developers had, unintentionally copied over real life customer data for doing testing or whatever, and they actually committed it up to the repo. That is another seriously flawed thing. If you're SOC 2 even, right, which I would call SOC 2 type 2 like the minimum baseline for compliance standards, right? You should not have customer data ever flowing through your testing pipeline in terms of like local dev or whatever, in terms of like being copied into. It's one thing if your local app is connecting to a pool and you're doing some sort of like, you have to work with some subset of data, but like putting it into a repository and pushing it up, huge no. That should be all in all your policies, and it should be detected. And anyway, so these are all basic things. I'm curious what your thoughts are on here. Our thoughts are on this here, Seth.
I,
But I was, you can
yeah.
tell I wasn't happy.
Yeah. I mean, oof. Seeing so many Git projects and GitHub projects over time, the inclusion of customer data as like test data in those repositories feels to me like something that's happened for a long time, because most of the time, most of the occurrences that I see with this are older projects that, and I'm talking like 10 plus years old, that never really like got the hygiene or get the same level of scrutiny as the up to date ones, right? So developers probably weren't going to do this, wouldn't do this just from a knee jerk reaction against a new project that they had just built. This is probably something that's been around for a long time, which makes me think that the Git history there, or the Git cleanup, or even just the customer data detection stuff wasn't enabled there, right? Yeah, David Lintner is absolutely right. If you're doing MFA, you will lose every single time. And so the only reason this came about is because a third party actually got into those repositories and was able to uncover all of this old historical badness that somebody hadn't looked at. And yeah, I like, it's a maturity thing, right? And I get when you step into an organization as an application security person or as a security person and you're taking over a team, like you've got to get your hands around what they're doing moving forward. But these sorts of gotchas are what going to kill you, right? Like these are what's going to place the blame on the current CISO, even though they probably weren't the ones that made those decisions to actually restrict that data, you know. Just knowing the organizations that I've stepped into where I have seen this, and honestly, like I have seen customer data in GitHub repositories within the last 3 months. Right? This is not an uncommon thing, especially in those test files or preloading of data files or whatever it is, test cases. It happens, and it usually is a maturity thing, and it's usually from a long time ago. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's usually exactly from some time ago. Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
and Robert brings up, and David kind of,
Yeah.
and Robert kind of bring up the same thing. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. I was just going to mention
No,
I'm just adding on what they say. They both kind of
yeah.
say the same thing, which is essentially the if I had to distill both David and Robert's comments down, it's like, first of all, prod data gets used all the time, which I realize that. That's why I kind of made that connect. That I was like, yeah, I know prod data gets used, but there are two things you can do on GitHub again, and I mean, yeah, I know a bit about GitHub's SCM, enough to know that there are at least two things you can do here to prevent like this whole idea of accidentally merging to main. First of all, block pushes to main. That's just, you have to require pull request flow, right? First of all. Second, when you do the pull request flow, you can enable, or require rather, that there's an approval that happens on that PR, meaning somebody else has to come in and they have to look at that PR and they have to attest to what's in it and say it's okay to actually merge. So that's how, so like, while I get your point that for sure it's easy to do and it's, and all of that, that's why SCMs give you these controls. And that's kind of my takeaway here, is that nobody did any security, it sounds like, on their SCM whatsoever. Like nobody took control of that GitHub account and said, we need to have these things enforced on that account to make sure that we don't do these, make these oopsies, basically. So I see your point. You're totally right. But also there are ways to mitigate some of these things.
Oh yeah. Yeah. And I didn't want to discount that. There are ways to mitigate it. But like I was saying, to Dave's point here, right? Like, that you would be surprised how many orgs use prod data in lower environments, even when they have policies that say they cannot. I see it. There's a lot of organizations that ignore the SCM capabilities, right? They just use GitHub, or they just transfer what was in TFS over into GitHub willy-nilly. No sort of one-to-one comparison, no enabling, or no enabling of MFA. It's just a place to store their code, and they don't take this sort of attack into account, even when they're moving from an on-premise device or an on-premise instance like TFS to GitHub or something along those lines. They forget that those are cloud environments, so the world has access, even though it's labeled as a private repository. If you can get access to those creds, all bets are off.
Absolutely. All bets are off at that point, you know?
Yeah. .env files, to Robert's point as well, right? Like everyone's pushed
everybody makes mistakes.
files.
Yeah.
I was having this discussion.
You have to have a .git ignore, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that .git ignore does avoid those things, but it is possible to omit the .git ignore altogether, to just not have put it up yet, or just to not like have an incomplete .git ignore that doesn't account for.
Yeah. Right. And to be honest, like I had this discussion with one of our interns earlier this week, right? In a private repo, they were doing some testing stuff, and accidentally, like, they were terrified because they had pushed up like some creds that then they went and changed. It was like, oh, we need to delete that pull request, and I'm like, okay, take a step back. This is a learning process, right? You're fine. The creds are no longer valid, and it was a private repo, right? The risk there is incredibly low, and take it as a learning process and don't do it again, right? Like everyone has made this mistake. It's fine. And I would rather you make it in this situation than 2 years down the road when you have access to production, API keys, and you do it then, right? I appreciate that you're terrified that you did something really horrible, but we're going to be understanding when it comes down to it.
And Bobby makes a good point, which is like, you can't rotate customer data. You can rotate credentials. Like to your point, not a huge deal. You can rotate the credentials. It may still live in Git history, or you can purge it from the Git history as well. You can do both. You should do both things.
Mhm.
But ideally, obviously, rotating credentials is the priority. But he's right. You can't rotate customer data. And then also his point about it, just the fact that like, hey, um, be mindful of the gay history aspect too. Earlier, I'm trying to make sure I pull out all the salient points. Do you see anything else I missed
Uh,
there?
no, yeah, like, and I like this discussion on customer data because it's one of the overlooked security issues. I mean, I know we always talk like from a security perspective, like when we're doing assessments, we find uh, enumeration flaws all over the place, right? Like, and we find authorization issues. But one of the like next up close to that is sensitive data disclosure, right? And usually customer data that's being exposed in some way that it shouldn't be. And this is one of the ways that it happens that we don't necessarily get into that much is the use in development and testing efforts. Um, and I feel like there's multiple ways to get around this. I mean, it's been a problem since my early days in software development, right? Trying to actually test with a full suite of customer data that tests all of the boundaries for an application. It's a difficult problem to solve. And again, we're stepping more into like QA testing or the QA testing realm that I love to talk about because, what are pen testers? Crappy QA testers, right? Um, but there are solutions that are out there that will like give you test data. And I feel like LLMs are a great place to go to actually generate massive amounts of test data that look like real customers. So
Yeah, there's companies that have cropped up as you to your point. Other people had that idea as well.
yeah,
It's actually a company I'm talking to, as a matter of fact, that does that. It's weird that you say that. I just got introduced to them a couple days ago. It's
yep,
super weird.
QA with extra spicy bugs. Yeah, but it is right.
Yeah,
Like LLMs can generate that sort of content that looks and feels like true customer data, but is virtual. It's generated. It'll give you the same sort of qualities and test cases. That being said, like I'm always like, why are we pushing test data into Git as it is, right? Like, yeah,
I don't know.
yeah,
But it does happen, and actually, there are some. As a company that obviously we review PRs all the time and code changes and all that stuff. I actually do see some companies who have repos that are just dedicated to holding test data. So sometimes it's a repository dedicated just to holding that data. Um, eh, but
yeah.
I don't know, man. This one just got under my skin because yes, I'll just say it. I use Zapier for sure. Not that heavily, but I use it somewhat. And yeah, as a customer, I was just like, that bummed me out because I know like we're much tinier and much earlier than the Zapier, right? And like I know what we have to go through all of our controls, through all of our controls, not just like the actual controls we put on our systems, but actually like all the policies we have to write and the enforcement that goes along with that. And it's like, how do you screw that up? And I know like I'm glad that we have a very forgiving community. I'm glad it's just me that's being very salty about this, but I did actually like
Well,
that actually got me kind of annoyed, we'll say, when I read that. I was like, come on, that's too easy. That's too easy.
yeah. Well, again, it goes back to the maturity, right? Like it goes back to where are the skeletons in the closet for your organization. And if you're stepping into an organization as the AppSec person, yes, you want to get your like I just want to reiterate, yes, you need to get your hands about what's going out the door new, but you need to know what exists across the board. And if you are in GitHub or TFS or any of the Git protocol SCMs, you should be monitoring that, right? Like, yeah, it should be on your list. So, risk
Yeah.
tolerance matters a lot. Yep. Cool. All right. Anything else you want to talk about there? Zapier,
No, I'll stop ranting about them knowing me.
come on,
Yeah.
they gave they put out a letter of contrition. It's okay, everything's fine.
Yeah, I mean, it's good that they owned up to it. It's good they put out a thing and they talked about it. It's just, yeah, it's like lesson learned, move on. But for sure, if you have GitHub or you have GitLab, whatever, if you have SCM and if you're listening to this podcast, you have an SCM, right?
Yeah.
Somebody's somewhere where you're hosting code. Just believe me, even if it's not your responsibility, take time to look through the security options they give you, because I promise you there's a lot of just silly problems that go away if you invest literally an afternoon into like just figuring out and going through the documentation and then of course, like depending on your org, you have to obviously go through the rigmarole of putting that stuff in place, but still it's worth it, I promise.
Yep. It is worth it. So check out your SCM and go from there. Okay. The next article I wanted to talk about was like the most British thing ever that came across my desk this week, right? The British government now has a method to assess forgivable and unforgivable vulnerabilities. Like I'm just like, my mind goes to Harry Potter and unforgivable curses, right? Like now we have unforgivable vulnerabilities from the National Cybersecurity Center in the UK. A method to, and I'm tongue in cheek, like it just made me chuckle initially, but it's an interesting way to go about assessing priority and risk of vulnerabilities when they are discovered. And I don't necessarily disagree with their assertions here in classifying vulnerabilities for an organization or for an application. It methodically lays out a way, and I don't know if you got in to actually read this yet, Ken.
Reading right now, I'm going through the 13 unforgivable vulnerabilities
Yes.
in the original MITRE 2007 paper, and apparently they still exist. So
yes,
not much has changed.
Yeah, and I'm showing it up here, right? Like, but
it seems like,
right, like
the ease of mitigation is a pretty big important factor. Is that correct?
it is, right? So when mitigation is really is a very expensive process, then there's more leeway for that vulnerability to exist because it's deemed difficult to do, and you still have to support the business, right? They're taking that into account. However, when it's mitigation's fully documented, it's very cheap to implement, and they have like a sliding scale on how you can actually classify these things, then it becomes unforgivable, right? Like it's, hey, guess what? You should actually know about it. And the other thing that I appreciated here is there's a lack of knowledge about it, right? They're taking into account what the developers actually have been trained on. Whoops, let me hide that. And whether or not they are familiar with those vulnerabilities within the context of that organization or that application, because that's going to jump into it, right? So yeah, I don't know, like I just it cracked me up, right? And of course, non-exploitable is the other. Like they've got forgivable, unforgivable, and then non-exploitable, which are right. Like again, we're taking into account kind of the exploitability factor and traceability analysis that's going on with SCA and software components.
Yeah, I'm trying to understand how is this going to be used. That's what I'm reading through, trying to understand. Like, okay, we're applying labels to these things. Mm-hmm. What does it mean? Like, is it a thing where if it's forgivable, then what? Like I don't even know. Like I'm struggling to even figure out like what, other than saying this one's forgivable and this one's unforgivable. Like how does that change your approach in your program? Like, I guess I'm struggling. I'm trying to figure out what their whole eradicating trivial vulnerabilities at scale. So the goal is to eradicate trivial vulnerabilities at scale. So
yes.
Their idea is that Proposes a
So
method that allows security researchers to assess if a vulnerability is right. We got that. Be applied. We'll probably pay attention to generate discussion with vendors as a as a call on vendors to work to eradicate vulnerability classes. Maybe top.
So I think they're dealing more with like overarching platforms, operating systems, IDs, like whatever it is. So instead of,
Okay.
hey, we've got very specific vulnerabilities within this, we're looking at vulnerability classes and basically encouraging, or we're going to start requiring vendors to eliminate unforgivable vulnerabilities. So think about SQL injection and how it used to be. Or like their example here that I'm showing on the screen right now is there was a 40%, 41% reduction of vulnerability reduction with the move from XP to Vista from banning string copy and associated functions, right? So by building security requirements or linters that or GitHub Actions, whatever it is, that flag and don't allow the use of certain functions, you can reduce vulnerabilities within an operating system, within an application. But you have to understand what those are and where the easy pickings are, right? So again, this is more of overarching kind of background recommendations. So similar to like when the White House was coming out with their, hey, don't use memory unsafe languages recommendations, right? Companies that are using C and C++ are still going to use C and C++, right? Yeah.
At the end of so you had originally provided me with two different links. One was like a summarized version, and then there's the full paper website that you have up now. In the
Yeah.
summarized version, at the very end of it, they say something interesting. They say, basically, they say, this will okay. I'll just read the full thing. So whilst very British, whilst vulnerabilities are hard to avoid, we can eradicate many using the right tools and approaches, such as those outlined by CISA, Secure by Design, America, and the UK government aimed at, and the Voluntary Code of Practice for Software Vendors, a systemic intervention by the UK government aimed at software vendors and designed to ensure that security is baked into software. Okay, cool. Lots of word salad, but the last sentence is, it will begin as voluntary code, but further policy interventions to support its uptake and impact are currently being explored. Now, to me, that gets to the heart of what you said, Seth, right? Which is, this is a way to have vendors follow some sort of structure. And
Mhm.
I don't know how I feel about any of this. I don't really, I'm having a hard time wrapping my brain around the efficacy, and also like some of the best vulnerabilities that really did need to be mitigated would have classified as unforgivable, or excuse me, as forgivable. Um, and why that kind of bothers me is, if forgivable, the idea is like, oh, like you have more time to like, I think it's more of what you're saying, where it's like you should have had tooling and stuff in place to like detect the unforgivable ones, but the forgivable ones are vulnerabilities that like they're so nuanced and they're so difficult to detect that tooling wouldn't have caught it. There wouldn't have been secure guardrails around it, and so they are forgivable in the sense that anybody could have made that mistake, and nobody has the arsenal that equips them to detect those types of vulnerabilities. Is what I think that they're saying there. So
Yeah.
they're
It's
trying
I,
to classify, if I'm understanding this correctly, just to round this out, they're trying to say that basically, if you didn't do your due diligence, then you introduced one of these stupid, silly flaws that shouldn't exist in your product. And then now this last sentence is telling me that they're headed in the direction of enforcement. Maybe.
mhm. Yeah. Yeah, it's a baseline. Hey, did you do your due diligence when you were coding this application? And you should be coding in a secure manner and not have any of this low-hanging fruit, as we refer to it, right? Like, in general, you should know about it. If you're going to be providing software to, in this case, the UK government, they're probably going to be looking at this as one of the requirements for using your software or paying for it, right? Eventually, right? Like it's voluntary right now, but it's going to become, it's going to become a requirement pretty quickly. Yeah. Yep.
Well,
and
and
don't use unforgivable vulnerabilities. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm
Should we start
trying
putting
to.
that in reports? Yeah. No, I don't know.
Yeah. Well,
Yep.
I'm biting my tongue.
You're biting
But
your
yeah.
tongue. What, as far as like
Oh, I'm just
government
biting. I'm
being
biting my tongue
involved, or
on.
what?
No,
Why?
just on what can be detected in terms of low hanging fruit versus. Anyways, whatever. I'm just gonna keep my mouth shut. I'm not gonna. I'm trying to today. I'm trying to stay in just the realm of traditional AppSec. So that's what I'm doing. Traditional AppSec tools, different linting tools. They can look for specific patterns and such, and that means low hanging fruit. And that's where I'll leave that for our listeners.
That's where you'll leave that.
Oh,
Okay.
I won't go on any tangents.
All right.
In any case.
Cool. So I think we've got probably time to do one more. We started a little bit late, but we probably time to have do one more article, right? Yes. Forgivable or unforgivable is the criteria now. Yes. That's gonna be our classification up to this, moving forward, right? Sweet. Do you want to talk about the API keys included in training data?
Sure. Yeah, I think it's probably not super. It's more. I thought I was trying to stay away from. I think I've been bombarding people with AI and LLMs and stuff, so I'm trying not to talk too much about that today. But I was glad I didn't post that. All right, you got that up there. Basically, Bleeping Computer has an article. In the training data, likely, it says likely, it doesn't say 100% used, but it's pretty likely that the Common Crawl website, or archive rather, which has 2.67 billion web pages with over 400 terabytes of data, it was pilfered. So that's likely used to train LLMs of all shapes and sizes. And Trufflehog did an analysis where they found almost 12,000. It was 11,908, almost 12,000 secrets that they were actually able to validate and authenticate with. So these aren't match the shape and pattern of a secret. These are, no, we actually validated, because I don't, Trufflehog, if you use the verify flag, they then go and call out. If you actually look at under the hood of Trufflehog, they've got these different modules. And so, like, for instance, with their OpenAI stuff, they'll actually call out to, I don't know, I forget. It's like there's like user and org endpoints, and they'll like try to get your username or so use some innocuous part of that, like, provider, their API, where it's innocuous, it's not state changing, it's just using it to get some information, but it does actually show that key is valid. And so that's how actually Trufflehog works, by validating keys, and in this case almost 12,000 valid keys. So that means, what I'm trying to say is, it sounds like roughly 12,000 keys probably made its way into LLM training data, maybe, though I imagine there's some sort of normalization of that data that it's put through. But I don't know. These folks are all moving really fast and quickly. So I don't, yeah, who knows? But what do you think? What's your takeaway from something like this, Seth? Put your keys on the internet. Don't secure GitHub.
Duh. I like, this seems like a fairly obvious issue, right? Given how we are training LLMs and the amount of data that we're sucking up from across the internet, and the fact that we just talked about customer data in Git repositories and leaking of keys through that same mechanism, LLMs are going to pick this up. On the flip side, I don't know if I necessarily find that as a bad thing, outside of, if it's your key, you necessarily don't want it to be exposed. You probably need to rotate it. But LLMs, and partially what we're doing with LLMs, needs to be able to analyze and recognize what a key looks like. So we either have to generate false ones, we have to do something with them in order for the LLM to recognize that as a sensitive piece of information in the format that's being pushed into it. So it's got to be trained on something, right?
Yeah,
Yeah,
right.
it would be
I
it would be
mean,
better if it was synthetic for sure, right? Or you at least were able to, generate some of those values that weren't necessarily good for real access into AWS and into other secrets. But we are taking advantage of that fact when we're doing searches and code bases and we're asking the LLM whether or not this secret looks valid. It's using that database and it's giving value back to us from that training data. So yeah,
yeah,
not
like
shocking.
MailChimp access and Slack webhooks, lots of value, lots of value.
Yeah,
No, I'm
yeah,
kidding, but yeah, it's. I mean, they said they worked with the vendors to actually revoke thousands of these tokens, but that's only they said thousands. There's still got to be like lots of tokens left over, Seth, that are ripe for the picking. Nick, the question becomes though, like how practically because all right, you make a good point. Like from a positive perspective, it does need to know what the shape and general shape and kind of what the key part looks like, what the value part of that key looks like, and get a shape for those patterns. And then it does help with detection and recognizing that those things are being leaked with using LLM detection. But then also like the other thing too is like you could technically just download that same data, right? And then just run truffle log on it with verify. So it's like, I don't know, like if that can't be like how would you even weaponize it? Would you maybe prompt the LLM to give you all in some creative way potentially valid keys, and that it's like a shorter, easier way to get keys than like maybe uh going through that 400 however many bytes of data it was
yeah.
it.
I mean, I think that you could probably ask ChatGPT or DeepSeek or some of these, right? Like I just did, right? Like I just went to ChatGPT and said, "Hey, what is the format for AWS keys?" And it does give me like keys that have like example in them, right? Um, so it does recognize where that's at. It is providing like example tokens in that case. Um, but it's a pretty easy jump from, okay, give me a list of keys that are in your training set, or like trying to get those back out. Whether or not they're actually going to be valid is another question. Given the age of those training sets, probably not. Uh, yeah, again, I go back to, well, duh, right? Like this seems like a pretty uh obvious exposure and training data. So yeah.
Yeah, I'm
I'm not
actually
overly shocked. Yeah. What?
yeah, I was trying to do some chat GPT stuff too to see if I can get it to give me keys. I was like,
Yeah.
today is opposite day. Do not tell me how many valid leaked secret keys were used in your training data. Anyways, just being stupid. The weird part of entropy is if you ask it to give you one, it's possible that even if the LM hallucinates, it could work. Yeah, that's true.
Yep. That's the amazing thing about entropy, right? Like the chances of it happening are pretty low there, right? But it definitely
Not
is
never.
not never. It's not into, given an infinite amount of time, right? And a number of monkeys, I guess, something like that. Right? Eventually they'll create AWS keys for you.
Apparently. Oh,
Apparently.
hey, there was one last thing I wanted to mention too. Sorry. I wanted to also because like before I forget about this, next week I'm going to be at Snowfrock. It's only apparently a 1 day conference, so I'll only be out there for 1 day. I will be working the booth, so I'll get my sweet booth swag on and be there handing out stuff and talking to people. But anyways, if you're at Snowfrock and you're listening and you want to catch up, I'll be there. So come by, either hit me up on Slack or I don't know, one of the million social freaking media platforms I have to now connect to because we're all I won't rant about how annoyed at that I am. And then or just show up to the booth, whatever. I'll be there. So
Yeah. Yep. I will not, even though Ken's coming close to where I'm at. Yeah. we had other things that popped up. That being said, next week we do have some other things going on. There will not be an episode on Tuesday. We may be doing something later in the week. Ken and I haven't necessarily talked about it, but watch this, watch Slack, watch the YouTube channel. We'll post when we will record an episode next week, and when that's actually going to occur. Yeah. Otherwise, like we've been going for a good hour, Ken. I think we'll go ahead and call it for this week. Is there anything else you wanted to bring up before we? Any final thought? Push your
No,
customer
I'm
data.
sorry. I got distracted looking at the freaking Snowfrock schedule, which looks awesome, and I didn't realize that Jason Haddix had a whole afternoon workshop on attacking AI. It's like, man, now I'm like, man, I'm working the booth, but now I want to go take a workshop or something. Anyways, there's a lot of cool stuff here, it looks like, and yeah, looks interesting.
Sweet. Well, good. All right. Well, thanks everybody for joining today. If you haven't yet, subscribe to the newsletter. And just in case that you miss an episode, we do try to summarize that. We do summarize the episodes on a weekly basis, send out some links and other things that we're thinking about. That's it. AppSec.com. You can sign up there. And yeah. Otherwise, we will see everybody online and see everybody next week.
All right. Cool. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.
See ya.